everyone. I was just asked to do this of recent, so I apologize if I ramble on. I am Laura Kelly. I have a Facebook page is what I have. It's called New Jersey Parents of Developmentally Disabled Adults. Another mom and I started. We have 800 people so far on it due to all the issues that we've encountered. I'm a mother of three, and my middle daughter, Alexa, who is 28, was born with Down syndrome. She also has severe autism and a really god-awful seizure disorder called Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. So she seizes pretty much daily. 5 years ago, well, in 2009, Alexa was put into a residential setting in Pennsylvania. And in 2014, she was removed from that setting due to a policy called Return Home New Jersey. She was brought back to New Jersey, put into a group home, and we had really catastrophic issues occur within 6 months of her placement there. So I've become very involved in this over the last few years. I've testified before the Senate Oversight Committee and to the Human Services Committee when I was having issues with the group home situation, reaching out to DDD, which is the Division of Developmental Disabilities under the Department of Human Services. I was not getting responses from them. My daughter was put into the ICU twice due to choking events that occurred in the home within 6 months of her placement there. And I eventually ended up having to stalk the governor in parking lots in order to get someone to respond. I provided him with the inspection reports to the group home that my local district assembly people had called appalling. And it was shortly after that that Return Home New Jersey, the policy had stopped. I don't want to take credit for it because there was a huge constituency of families that had worked very hard in trying to get it reversed, and they were able to accomplish that. So what have I learned in the last couple of years? I have learned that the Department of Human Services consumes about 52% of the state's annual budget. This year's budget was $34.5 billion. And DHS took about $19 billion of that for services, for Medicaid, and for people like my daughter and other disabilities, the elderly. I've heard senior legislators in the state publicly say that the department is not run very efficiently. And I personally experienced what that is like. And as a taxpayer, I'd like to know why it's not run efficiently, something that consumes more than half the state budget. What I've also learned is a lot of these community support providers, the largest ones, are owned and operated by private equity firms. They are for-profit agencies. They buy up real estate, expand portfolio holdings in real estate. They put in workers that make no more than $9 or $10 an hour. The majority of the workers, I will say, are good people, good caring people, being women for the most part, who have not had many opportunities in life. So they are forced to work 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 hours. My current caregiver to my daughter, she works an 80-hour work week. Monday through Friday, she has 30 hours of downtime to herself, and that includes driving. And she is a single mother trying to raise 2 boys on her own. So, and this is pretty prolific through these group homes. So the workers, the only requirement to work in a group home is a high school diploma, and that includes for the managers also. I've encountered managers that probably don't read at more than the 6th grade level and are responsible for managing and administering medication. For example, I had a caregiver one time ask me if a suppository for constipation should be cut up and put into applesauce. And the same caregiver would be responsible for administering my daughter's seizure rescue med, which, if not administered correctly, could kill her because she would stop breathing. A lot of times the medications do go missing. There's countless medication errors, causing my daughter having to be taken to the ER. And there she's being exposed to all sorts of hospital infections, which she has experienced, leaving her on a ventilator for 47 days and a 96-day hospital stay. So, So the system is very broken, and it needs to be repaired. I do not know the answers to any of it. Governor Christie has put a lot of funding over the last few years into developing more group homes. I do applaud that effort, but in honesty, it's so broken that I don't think it's a good use of taxpayer money. They're expanding now in these behavioral group homes for drug addiction and all. If they're being staffed by the same people that are not qualified to be staffing them, once again, I think it's more money that's not being spent wisely. So that's my story. I'm hoping that John can answer some of our questions that we have regarding these issues. And Kevin, are you? So, and thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Laura, so much. I also want to introduce a very, very good friend of mine. His name is Raja Sandor. He's actually been volunteering here with the campaign. He came all the way out here from Ohio because he believes that a governor of John Wisniewski would radically make a difference in the lives of people here in New Jersey. 9 million people here, and he's fighting. He's here in the office from 9, 10 o'clock in the morning until very, very late at night. He's a wonderful person and a wonderful friend. I want to introduce Raja Sandor.
Thanks, Kevin. And thank you so much for letting me be here with you guys today and for letting me to speak with you. As Kevin said, my name is Raja Sandor. I was born with congenital phocomelia and without the femur in my right leg. Congenital phocomelia merely means without limbs from birth. Growing up in rural Ohio, I watched as my mother had to fight with a number of different agencies and doctors even to make sure that I was receiving all of the services and care that I actually needed. And, as I got older, I became acutely aware of the struggle of fighting the perception of those receiving government assistance. And I wish that there had been someone like John fighting for me and for my family back then. I got involved in field organizing last year because I believed that I needed to fight for candidates that were fighting for me, like Bernie Sanders and for like Hillary Clinton. And it's that same desire to fight for it's that same desire that has led me to fight now for John Wisniewski. Throughout the course of his 21-year career as an assemblyman, John Wisniewski has been acutely aware of the issues facing the disability community, and as John has sought to lend his voice to our causes, I believe now we must lend our voice to make sure that John is the next governor here in this great state. And that means picking up the phone and making calls to people who may not know John and may not understand what's at stake in this election. That means having face-to-face conversations with people in your communities. And so if you are in a position to join us and volunteer, I ask that you would find myself afterwards or Josh Levin, who's the organizer in your area. Or Kevin or another member of the staff, or revisit the registration desk out front. It really will take all of us to make sure that we win here on June 6th. I came out here from Ohio, as Kevin mentioned, to work on John's campaign because of his commitment to fighting for everyone. In 2012, if I have heard this correctly, John fought to make sure that the state Democratic Convention was accessible for everyone. And that was not necessarily an easy fight, but John believed that it was a fight worth waging and made sure that it happened. It's that same commitment that has led John to believe that we need to fully fund our education system, to introduce a single-payer universal health care plan. He believes that it is the government's responsibility to fulfill that promise to fully fund the pensions of its employees. He believes that no new pipelines are needed, and he wants to really make that a priority. Wants to end the privatization of prisons and decriminalize marijuana. This is a man, as Kevin said, that I came here from Ohio to fight for, that I believe is worth fighting for. And so if you will, please join me in welcoming the man I'm proud to go to work for every day, Assemblyman John Wisniewski.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm glad you're all here. The man who's operating the sound system said I need to raise this up because I'm a little taller than average so that everybody can actually hear me. So thank you all for being here, and let's hear it for Raja. And also, Laura, thank you for being with us once again and sharing your story. It's compelling, and it has formed part of what we're talking about today. So I'm so glad you could join us again. I want to just thank everybody for being here and giving me the opportunity to engage in a dialogue with you. The process that we're in, selecting the next governor, more acutely selecting the next Democratic nominee for governor, is a process that ought to be open to everyone in the state. Everybody who's a Democrat or unaffiliated ought to have an opportunity to consider the candidates, to hear from the candidates, to engage the candidates, and then make a decision. Unfortunately, we see access to that process being limited by the very leaders of the party who want everybody to believe that they are in favor of more access. And so that is an important element to consider as we meet here today, but as we go forward. Because one of the things that I have long been a champion of is access. And when I had the fortune to be the state Democratic chairman, I made sure that we did something that my predecessors had not done and my successor has not done, is to make sure that our state party meetings were in places and done in a way that made them accessible to everybody. And that's an important part, not just for a political party. It's certainly important for a political party, but it's more important for government. Because when we think about the fundamental nature, if you're in this room, you lean Democratic, I would say, and you believe that government has a valuable mission. What is that mission? Why are we here? What is it that binds us together? Well, I think one of the things that fundamentally brings us together is that we believe that government exists to help not the people who already don't need help, but to help those who have no one else to speak for them, difficulty accomplishing those things that everybody else takes for granted, to help those who need help. That is the fundamental role of government. And so when we talk about this election, we talk about it in terms not only of what do the candidates believe in, but what process are they willing to engage in. And the process that I have engaged in since announcing my candidacy on November 15th of last year is trying to get in front of as many groups as possible, to try to engage in a conversation with as many people as possible, not only about what I believe, because obviously you need to make a choice on who you'd like to support for governor, but also to hear your concerns and to answer your questions. Because we see that the political process over the years has become homogenized, has become shrink-wrapped. Soundbite politics is what governs us. Simple platitudes is what we hear. And so I would not only challenge you, I would ask you to challenge me, that the issues of the day that we have to confront, and we're here today to talk about individuals with disabilities, but the issues in the campaign at large are issues that are not, I don't think it's a fair conversation to engage in platitudes. You know, we have an economy that's struggling. For a candidate to say, I want good jobs, I would be willing to guess that there is nobody running for office that doesn't want good jobs. There's no constituency for that. And so for a candidate to tell you that we are going to create good jobs, it's like, okay, you know, tell me what's next. And so let me go back to what I'm supposed to talk about. I digressed there a little bit. So when we talk about access, we have to think about all of us as having equal access. All of us should have an equal opportunity to influence government. But we see far too frequently, especially not only in this election season, but the last election season, that there were people who had more access than others. Folks with a lot of money have more access than others. Party leaders have more access than others. And fundamentally what this campaign is about is changing that dynamic. Because regardless of how much money you have, the political process should not be weighted in favor of money. No matter how much political power you have, the political process should not be weighted in favor of those who wield that power. Because when we think about an election, we think about each and every one of us embracing and supporting enthusiastically in November the candidate we choose in June. And that has to be one of the guiding factors of how we move forward. And so I'm proud of the work that I've done over my 21 years in the General Assembly. And I think, you'll hear in this campaign, and you'll hear the discussion about, and we've seen it in last year's campaign, this trend or this thought process that somehow experience doesn't matter, that we need to bring in outsiders to make government better. We're seeing firsthand exactly what happens when you bring in the consummate outsider into government. And when you talk about the issues that are important in this room, when you talk about a Secretary of Education who essentially wants to undo the Department of Education and undo the funding of the IDEA, you see the real scary prospects of what that actually means in terms of policy. It's not just enough to have somebody come in and say, hey, I've got a better idea because I'm not tainted by what's happened before. You really need somebody who actually understands what happens in government. And we're in a very, very precarious place because we see the threat from Washington, D.C. We see exactly what the possibilities may be with the policies a Trump administration wants to impose. And we know right here in New Jersey, we have the 13th largest disabled population in the nation. Over 1 million people. In a state of 9 million, over 1 million people, over 12% of our population. And so we have to take the issue of how we treat that population very seriously, and equally treat the issue of what happens to us as a state if federal resources that we have relied on, in some cases since the 60s and in other cases since the 80s, if those resources either worst case dry up or best case get reduced. We know either of the two is probably coming. We here in New Jersey need to prepare for it because the statistics are very alarming. If you were to hear just in general a unemployment statistic of 62%, you would say that something is drastically wrong. Well, in our disabled population between 18 to 64, we have 64% unemployment, which means we as a state are not doing our job, that we are not providing the facilities to bring together job seekers and job givers, employers and employees. We need to do a better job of matching them up. We need to protect, going forward, we need to protect those things that, frankly, we have taken for granted because the federal government has been there to underwrite them. So when we talk about Medicaid and we talk about the expansion in the early 80s that allowed for a lot more money to be dedicated toward the disabled population, we recognize that that can be rolled back under a Trump administration. We hear the threat of block grants, that the Medicare and Medicaid programs could be devolved into block grants, which would drastically and adversely affect us in this state. So what you have to look for in the next leader for the state of New Jersey is somebody who is willing to stand up and fight, because it's not going to be enough to say, well, this is what they're doing and we're going to have to accept it. We're going to have to stand our ground here in New Jersey and make sure that we're not giving an inch to a Trump administration policy that wants to attack the most vulnerable members of our population, that wants to take away money that now is used to help bring everybody into the mainstream. That's something that we need to be very careful about. When we talk about what can we do here in New Jersey in response to that Trump agenda, one of the things that I think is the best solution, one of the things that we have the facility to do, we have to have the courage too, and that's an issue we should talk about, but we certainly have the ability, and I am advocating, and I'm in fact the only candidate advocating for it, is a state-run, single-payer healthcare system. We can take the existing resources that we get from the federal government. We can take the existing state resources that we use for health care. we can take the existing premiums that are paid and combine them into a state-run, single-payer healthcare system that will guarantee universal access for everybody in the state, including our disabled population. And so that those programs today that we worry about being misused or misallocated by the federal government, we will have domain and control over. And I do think that that's something that we can do. In addition to that, as I talked about the unemployment rate among the disabled population, there is no mechanism in state government right now to match employers with prospective employees in the disabled community. And so what I'd like to see and what I would do as governor is within our Department of Human Services, or perhaps in conjunction with the Department of Labor, is that we create a program so that we can match up those jobs with the disabled population who want to be independent, who want to find employment, who want to have that opportunity to experience the freedom that everybody else takes for granted. We don't have the ability to do that now. We don't have a program set up to do that. I believe that that's something that we absolutely need to do. We also need to make sure that we are working to level the playing field. We see far too often, for instance, in women's health care, an inability to receive the same level of care and access to care and unbiased treatment for the disabled population that the non-disabled population have. And we need to make sure that we're leveling that playing field and providing that equal access and equal opportunity to women's health care. We recognize that, again, under this governor, Planned Parenthood, funding for women's health care has been cut on both cases the entire term of this governor. We need to reverse that and not only just put back the money that we had, but increase the funding that we should have so that we're providing a robust level of services in women's health care, but also making sure that for the disabled population, they have equal access and no hindrance to access because of their disabilities. We also see a problem with law enforcement and the interaction between law enforcement and the disabled population. It's in most cases not because law enforcement is hard-hearted. It is probably because of a lack of training and a lack of understanding. And we need to make sure that we are providing that training and that coaching and that mentoring so that law enforcement community understands the special needs and challenges that the disabled population has so that we can make sure that we have fair outcomes and equal outcomes as opposed to what we're seeing now. I'm going to conclude my remarks so that we have an opportunity to have a discussion. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about some of the other items that are equally important and I think help promote the agenda we're talking about here today. We have to make sure that our economy is moving forward. And as I said earlier, it's one thing as a candidate to say we want good jobs. Who doesn't? But how do we get there? We talk about how our economy has lagged over the years in New Jersey. One of the things that we have failed to do is invest in our alternative energy programs. We used to have a fund that we used to invest in solar. That money has now been used to balance the budget. We've lost the jobs because of that mistake made by this governor. We need to reverse that, so we're investing in alternative energy. We will create jobs and help grow our economy. And what will that do? It'll provide the revenue and the assistance that we need to do the work that we talk about today for the disabled population. We need to make sure that we're increasing the minimum wage. When we see that over a third of our population lives at or below the poverty level, when we see that so many people have a hard time not only providing for housing, but providing for food, providing for medicine, we see that we can do better, and I'm calling for, and I have, as a legislator, supported a $15 an hour minimum wage. And one of the first things that I'll do as governor is ask the legislature to send me that bill, but I'll also sign an executive order to make sure that immediately state contractors or state employees, especially those employees who are working with our disabled population, are no longer earning starvation wages in caring for our most precious commodities. I think they need to be making a $15 an hour minimum wage, and in some cases more, but at bottom threshold, it should be $15 an hour. And finally, education is important. And as I mentioned earlier, with the threat by the Trump administration to essentially undo the Department of Education, the funding that comes from the Department of Education, one of the largest components is the funding for IDEA and the money that goes to help school districts offset the cost of special education. If that goes away, that gets made up by New Jersey property taxpayers. We're going to have to fight real hard to hold on to that money, but we're also going to have to make sure that we're finding cost-effective ways in the event that we lose that money, that we can continue to provide those services. We have worked so long and so hard to make sure that regardless of the disability, that young men and women have the opportunity to participate in a public education setting. We can't go backwards now. One of the things that we can do on a state level is to make sure that we're funding our public education system because, as many of you know, this governor for the past 7 years has chronically underfunded it, and this year we're $1.6 billion below where the School Funding Reform Act says we should be. I would restore that funding starting in the first year to make sure that we're fully funding it, and then looking at how we can increase the opportunities for our disabled population to fully participate in school districts that are close to home, that have a local feel. And I think that's something that we have to do. But not only that, there are so many young men and women who come out of high school and don't have the opportunity to move beyond because of the cost. And we see so many young men and women coming out of school now, crippled with student loan debt, and their first decision out of school isn't about whether they can get a job in the career they've chosen. It's about whether they can make that first student loan debt payment. We need to stop that, and what I'm calling for is a program where young men and women in New Jersey who come from families earning $125,000 or less a year can get a free public college or university education, tuition free, so that we can end that cycle of debt, that we can give them the hope to get the jobs that they're looking for, whether it's in the healthcare field, whether it's in education, so they don't have to worry about paying the loan. They can worry about starting their careers. These are some of the issues that we've been talking about throughout the campaign. But I'll conclude on this note, is that leadership is about setting an example. At the end of the day, a governor can have all of the sound policy proposals and get a Democratic legislature to agree with them. But the governor has to set the tone on the debate and the way we'll conduct business in New Jersey. And for the past 7 years, we've seen a governor who has set a tone that is belligerent, that is intolerant, that is dismissive. And when you look at the things we see publicly happening with the rise in hate crimes, with the rise in intolerance, it's not a mistake to look at the role model being created and see the results happening publicly. And now we have that same model being carried out at the highest levels of government. We need to change that dynamic here by having a leader who is willing to listen, who is willing to be respectful, and has a track record of having done just that. Don't judge me as a candidate by the things I say in this room. Judge me by what I've done for 21 years in the legislature. That's the best indicator of what kind of governor that I will be. I am here to listen and to engage you in a conversation and ultimately obtain your support. I want to thank you for listening so attentively, and I look forward to a very nice debate and discussion as we move forward through the afternoon. Thank you all very much. Perfect break time, too. So with that, I'll open up the floor to questions. Yes, ma'am, your name? There's a microphone coming for you so that they can hear you.
And I work with people in prisons. I'm so glad you mentioned prison privatization. I have one quick question, but then I have a little harder question. My quick question is,
Sure.
When you talk about disabilities, I hope you're also thinking about people with mental disabilities. That's number one.
The entire spectrum.
Okay.
The entire spectrum.
The second thing is that we have an elephant in this state, which is the result of what happened when we began to dismantle the state psychiatric hospitals without
Yes, we do.
providing community mental health services that are what were needed for the people who were in those warehouses. And therefore, as many of us may know, I hope you don't know this actually, but if you don't, let me tell you that a lot of those people who used to be in those large hospitals are now in our large prisons with physical disabilities and with mental disabilities. They don't belong there, and the people who run the jails and the prisons don't belong there. We have an honest jail warden in Mercer County who says people with mental disabilities shouldn't be in this jail. We don't have the facility for it, etc. So what happens is we have a lot of people with mental disabilities in cages. We don't have a system to stream out people who need treatment to the treatment agencies and people who need to be in the Department of Corrections to the Department of Corrections. I'm almost done. So
It's okay, take your time. You're the first question.
So that's point number one is there are a lot of disabled people in the wrong places. Second is that because the human services system and the mental health system has been inadequately funded and resourced, those people don't just stay in the jails and prisons. They cycle, just like people used to cycle in and out of psychiatric hospitals. They are now cycling from jails to hospitals to prisons to homelessness in the street. And solving this, I'm not going to ask you how to solve this problem because it's a very big problem, but it requires attention at least to begin to address it and see how we can reconfigure these two systems so that people with mental disabilities aren't, and other disabilities aren't in cages. That will take time and attention. Those people, by the way, in those jails and prisons don't vote, and if you're talking about access, we need, those people should have access to our, I hope you agree, to our electoral system. Okay, so to do that, the last thing, this is hard, we're going to have to raise taxes. We're going to have to look at what Governor Whitman did when she stopped, when she reduced taxes on wealthy people, and so we lost a lot of money in order to do the things that you're talking about that we want for the people that we love and for the people who are confined or not. We're going to have to raise taxes. You're going to do that?
So this is what happens when two lawyers get microphones. Right? So there are lots of subparts to the question. That's okay. So we have to have a serious conversation in this state about what it is we believe in first and decide, are we willing to pay for it? Because far too often the debate is let's talk about what we're willing to pay for and figure out whether it's what we believe in. And that's what's gotten to us to where we are today. So let's start with the part of your question about mental health. We have a mental health crisis in New Jersey, in part because we have allowed an insurance industry to game the system to limit access. Now, if you're fortunate enough to have health insurance, you have access to mental health care. Some. Perhaps not as much as you need. If you don't, you have no access. And what we see, as you correctly pointed out, not only in our prison population, but in our emergency room population, people who have mental health needs that are going unaddressed. A report that I've been made aware of recently suggested that part of the underpinnings of our opioid crisis in New Jersey is mental health based. And that so many people who wind up in this vicious cycle of an opioid abuse and addiction and dependency have no way to get out of it because they get arrested, they get temporary treatment, they're back out on the street, and repeat. And so that's a funding issue. Talking about access, as we said earlier, we have, for reasons that are perhaps lost to many of us today, limited access to people who are incarcerated. And we need to change that because everybody ought to have access to the ballot box. And the more people that have access to the ballot box, the better the outcome of our elections will be. It's not only about that, but it's making sure we have same-day voter registration. It's making sure that the political process is run in a fair and democratic system because we see the very process that's being used to select candidates, at least on the Democratic side, is anything but fair or democratic, and in many cases, decidedly undemocratic. And I'll give you one example. We as Democrats have often got on the floor of the Assembly or House of Representatives or Senate and decried Republican efforts to make sure that people come to the polling places with IDs. We have said voter ID laws are designed to suppress turnout. And when you look at all of the Democratic conventions that have been held to select the nominee, the one thing that the county chair tells everybody is you can't vote without an ID. And so if we really believe that for the primary election, the general election, we ought to believe it for our internal processes. We have another county that actually makes you pay $26 to participate in the process. And so we have to change that. The only way we're going to have a better outcome is if we open up the political system. And then finally, to your point, and I started with this point, is we have to make sure that we have the right level of funding for what we need. I'm talking about a single-payer healthcare system. I believe that while that will cost us money, it will save us money in the long run by making sure that everybody in the state has access to healthcare as opposed to some. We, first of all, do away with the notion of uncompensated care and the money that we have to pay to hospitals for that. We do away with the losses that hospitals and healthcare providers have to endure because of uncompensated care. And we also wind up providing people with access to health care at an earlier stage in the disease cycle so that somebody who has high blood pressure is able to go and get medicine for that high blood pressure as opposed to waiting until they have kidney disease and showing up in an emergency room at a very, very high cost. And so those are some of the answers to your questions. I hope that at least addresses most of what you asked. Thank you. Yes, sir, in the back. Give me your name. Just talk loud into it. I think it'll come to life.
Yeah, my name is Luke Kopish, and I work for the Alliance Center for Independence, which is one of 11 independent living centers in New Jersey. So my question, and we work with people with disabilities in Union, Somerset, and Middlesex counties.
Sure.
Our main concern, one of our main concerns, is transportation. Transportation to get to work, transportation to visit family, transportation to get here.
Sure.
It's a big issue for people with disabilities as well as seniors. However, a couple of years ago, the casino revenue funds, which casino revenue pot of money, which funds paratransit services in the county-based paratransit, went down.
Yes.
You use your hand motion,
Yeah,
it went all the way down.
Yeah.
So, in effect, people with disabilities and seniors were left stranded as far as lack of transportation. So they've cut back on things like social and recreational type of trips and non-medical emergency kinds of trips. And these are vital for someone's livelihood to get out in the community. So my question is, what would you do as governor to look for other sources of revenue to increase funding for paratransit services?
Well, it's an important aspect first, and let me talk about that. We have not only the 21 counties with some version, they have different names around the state, of access transportation services. They get money from the casinos. We have Access Link run by New Jersey Transit, which is not run as well as it should be, and obviously New Jersey Transit is under terrible strain and doing very poorly just serving their basic mission. And so, again, we come to this thorny issue that we have across the spectrum for just about every issue we can discuss in New Jersey. It comes to a lack of financial support. When we talk about the core of the money for the services you're talking about coming from the casinos, we recognize that that tax, that percentage of revenue from casinos, although the percentage number has stayed the same, the take that New Jersey would earn from casinos has gone from, I think it was 12 billion about 5 years ago, to something in the order of 6 billion. And so the income on that fund has been cut in half. Here's a couple of things that I would do, is I would look at increasing that percentage, so we're keeping the sum of money for that service as close to the original amount, if not increasing it, but also looking at how we already divert that casino money to other areas that shouldn't be. We have to stop the corporate welfare that we see being doled out in New Jersey. Over the last 7.5 years, we've spent close to $8 billion in corporate welfare, all in programs that would have you believe, at least if you listen to a narrative description of it, are well-intended. Create jobs, entice companies to bring jobs, entice businesses to locate here. But what we see, if you just did the math on the total amount spent and the jobs created, what New Jersey has spent is over $100,000 per job. But we haven't been creating $100,000 jobs. We've been creating $20,000 to $40,000 jobs. And so for each job we're creating, we're actually spending more to create the job than the job is paying, which is a net drain on the state general revenue fund, and we have to do better. I would call for a moratorium on those corporate welfare schemes and make sure we're devoting that revenue to help the population that needs it the most. Right, again, thinking about where government should be devoting its resources first is we have to be able to help those who have no one else and nowhere else to turn. And clearly our disabled population becomes number one on that list. But thank you for that question. Another question. Oh, come on, somebody's got to have a question. All right, right back here, young man.
Thank you. My name is Dalton. I'm a public school teacher. I teach middle school, so I have the opportunity to work.
Where do you teach, Dalton?
I teach in Monmouth County.
Oh, okay.
So I have the opportunity to work with varying needs with really talented people, but we're looking at budget cuts currently, and
Sure.
Trump's plan obviously will make that problem much worse. What could you do to make sure that all students have an equal opportunity to succeed?
Sure. So I had mentioned in my remarks two things. We have not fully funded the School Funding Reform Act. So number one, in my first budget as governor, I would make sure we're fully funding the School Funding Reform Act. If we were to do that in this current budget year, that would be $1.6 billion more. Because we know what happens when we underfund public education. There's two consequences. First of all, most teachers are, just eager to help their students and do a good job, so they reach into their own pocket to help supplement what the district's not doing. And we see it all the time. But we also see local property taxes go up because when the state's not funding local education, it gets made up for by the local property taxpayer. By fully funding the School Funding Reform Act, we can unwind that cycle. But number two, we also have to look at what's happening on the federal level, because we recognize that there's over $1 billion a year that comes into New Jersey. Part of it is for special education under IDEA, but the other part goes in a lot of different formula areas, and we have to be prepared to not only fight back and make sure those cuts don't happen on a federal level, but prepare here in New Jersey to make sure that we are raising the necessary revenue to keep our school systems as good as they are. Because I'm willing to say, unlike the current governor, that our public school system, every time you look at a national ranking, is somewhere 1, 2, or 3 nationally among all the states, which is why when you look at all of the multinational corporations that have their headquarters in New Jersey, they come here because they know we have well-educated young men and women who go to good schools, who come out and become good employees. If we stop funding that cycle, those employers ultimately will recognize that New Jersey is not quite as good as it used to be. And so we need to make sure that we continue that funding. And the last point I'll talk about is during the governor's budget address recently, he challenged the legislature to rewrite the school funding formula in 100 days. So if any of you have followed what goes on in Trenton, the notion of the legislature rewriting the school funding formula in 100 days ought to scare you. It ought to scare you if this governor had another year, but it ought to scare you even more for a governor who's on his way out the door to say, I'd like to rewrite the formula so whoever comes after me is going to have to deal with my ideology. So I believe that we ought to table that. We ought not try to rewrite that formula. The next governor ought to have an opportunity to fully fund a very well thought out formula that we have now. Let's examine it after a year and decide if any tweaks are necessary. But thank you for that question. Thank you. Someone over here. Yes, sir.
Hi.
Let's get the microphone for you.
My name is David Perry Davis. I'm also an attorney, and I actually have 5 questions, but I'll wait because I had 6, and one of them was already asked.
All right.
And
I'll tell you what, we'll take your first one, and then if no one else, we'll let you go to the second one.
And we can break it up. It's kind of urgent. As I said, I'm an attorney, and I do a lot of family law and civil rights actions. And in the last month, I've had 3 people that were afraid to go to court, people that were undocumented,
Sure.
2 domestic violence victims, and 1 person that needed to enforce child support. And they were terrified. There's an example out of Texas where an abuser called ICE, and during a break in a domestic violence hearing, a woman was taken out and brought to Mexico. I didn't believe this. I heard it from one of the people that did not want to go to court, looked it up, and it's true. So what, as governor, can we do to resist this terrorism coming out of these policies I don't agree with coming out of Washington, and what can we do right now as an assemblyman and as an attorney, aside from writing to Judge Grant again? What can we do to stop this? It's just, this is not America.
Well, it's frightening because we have now taken intolerance and made it national policy, and that's not the America I know or you know or that anyone knows. We have always been recognized, if nothing else, as being a very tolerant, open society. I mean, that's how we were founded. And so the notion now that we will view people who look differently with suspicion runs against the core of everything we believe. On the day that Donald Trump first put his first immigration ban, I went up to Newark Airport that night with one of the attorneys from my law office just to offer assistance to people who were coming in to Newark Airport. And you think about exactly what was happening. There was somebody on a plane landing in Newark Airport. When they got on the plane, what did they think? They thought they were going home because New Jersey's where they live, or the metropolitan area. They didn't think they were going on a visit. They were going home. And they got to Newark Airport, and they were basically told, "You're not welcome here." But no one could tell them go home because this was home. Where were they going to go? And so we went up to provide assistance. And that thinking has to change. So what can we do here in New Jersey? So here's the odd thing for all of us who are progressive, who are liberal, who value democratic values. For a long time, if somebody had said the statement to you about states' rights, you would think they were talking about, the 1950s Alabama or South Carolina or something like that. Well, now states' rights mean something entirely different, because the federal government, under the 10th Amendment, can't make New Jersey do the things that it wants to do unless they're willing to do it themselves. And so as governor, I have the ability, if I'm fortunate enough to be governor, I have the ability to draw a very bright line about where our state resources will be employed. As a matter of fact, I've just done a bill that came out of the Assembly Transportation Committee directing that the Port Authority not use any of its resources, because they are essentially government resources, to assist ICE in any of their efforts. They're going to have to do it on their own. And where that becomes very important is in our municipalities, in our counties, where they can't navigate the streets of, Princeton or Newark or Sayreville or anywhere else without the assistance of local police. They don't have the boots on the ground, so to speak. So right now they rely on that. As governor, my policy will be, you can't rely. We're not going to provide assistance, because that's not what we're about as a nation. But we have to remember that we have the ability right now to continue to fight it under this current governor. As I said, I put that one bill forward to make sure that we're not using Port Authority resources. But there's something else that's going on right now, and it comes back to a money issue. Everything in New Jersey comes back to money. Is we have so many municipalities and counties that sign agreements with the federal government to help, essentially they get paid to help arrest and incarcerate people for ICE. They don't do it out of some sense of nationality or loyalty to the border. They do it because there's money in it. I have a piece of legislation that would preclude and prohibit counties and municipalities from entering into those agreements. But thank you for that question.
One thing to that, which is consistent with what you said.
Sure.
Which is that the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, gave.
Here, take the microphone so everybody.
The American Civil Liberties Union, Dave, has a nationwide grassroots effort to get people to go to their municipalities, and then and we're doing that in Princeton, and then to go to their counties to enact local ordinances do not violate federal laws, but basically say we're not playing with you to the ICE
Correct.
people. So if you'd like to know about that, anyone like to know about that?
That's a great
please
idea.
See me after, and we're moving forward in Princeton, and we're going to look around at the other communities in the neighborhood. to help you out.
Fantastic. You have a question? Cecilia, did you have a question now? Yes, ma'am. Microphone's coming your way.
Hi, my name is Amy Lerner, and I'm not an attorney. But
Finally, we
I am-
have one non-attorney in the audience.
But I am the parent of a 35-year-old daughter, and I have spent my life fighting and advocating for her. And what I want to know is as governor or even in the assembly, can you do to make the system, DDD, work in a much more transparent fashion? For example,
Sure.
my daughter was on the waiting list for residential blah, blah, blah for 12 years, which is not atypical. She's now on the CCW, which is for funding residential money for her. Part of what we need are direct support providers, which are the most underpaid people. My daughter cannot live by herself and needs these people to help her have the type of normal, independent life we want for her. What DDD has done, the state has done, they had a system where under this program, if you wanted to self-direct and hire your own people, which is really a wonderful way to do it, there was an agency called Easter Seals, which I'm sure everybody's heard of Easter Seals, that was going to be paying the people working for me. Now, the state, DDD, DHS, decided, well, we want to have one fiscal intermediary. In other words, one company paying for all the different parts of the state. And instead of using these local companies, which are charitable organizations, they've just hired a company, I believe, called PPL, which is from Massachusetts, which works in many states. And so all that we were told was, oh, don't worry about it. It's going to be no big deal. We're just changing the fiscal intermediary. They actually sent us out letters. What they didn't bother to say was that the people working for us were going to lose all benefits if they were full-timers. This was in the FAQ section of a letter.
Sure.
And I'm working with my assemblyman, Daniel Benson, to try and stop this. But the point is, they didn't even let us know this is coming. So we work hard. We can't pay these people more than X amount dollars. And we find good people that we can trust that won't hurt our children.
Sure.
And now they're going to say, oh, well, we're not giving you the sick days that you earned as a full-timer. We're not giving you any paid vacation. We're not giving you the health insurance you were promised. And this is going to happen over the next couple of months. And none of my letters to Barbara Connolly or, Elizabeth Connolly or Liz Shea have been answered. So there's something really wrong. I think somebody got a big payoff to take this for-profit company that came from out of state.
So, I mean, that's a very complicated issue, but I will try to break it down into parts. I mean, first of all, what you see happening there is what has been kind of a trademark of the current administration for past 7 years, is find aspects of state government, turn them over to private operators who have not the interest of the people of the state of New Jersey at heart, but have a profit interest at heart, and their goal is to make the most money and have the lowest costs, and that doesn't benefit the disabled community or anybody else in any other aspect of state government. And we see it time and time again across state government. And so as governor, if I'm fortunate enough to be your governor, I want to reverse that trend, because I don't believe turning over critical state functions to private businesses are the way that we should be operating. We ought to be making sure that we're delivering those services for the best outcome for our constituents, for our patients, for our young men and women, for our disabled community. And I believe that our proposal for a single-payer healthcare system will be able to address a lot of those concerns, because instead of having insurance companies address certain parts of it and different providers address different parts of it, and having a kind of a maze that almost seems like it's deliberately making it difficult for you to get the help you need, there'd be one-stop shopping, one provider who will cover all of these services, and we will make sure that we have a robust level of services available that will be provided for through a single-payer healthcare system. And that's what I propose to do if I'm fortunate enough to be governor. What I will do as an assemblyman is work with people like Dan Benson, who is a fantastic assemblyman and a very strong advocate, to try to make sure that we're exposing the mismanagement of the Christie administration. Unfortunately, he gets to be governor for 10 more months. And there's not a lot that we can do to change that. We could hope that perhaps he takes that talk radio spot and he'll leave earlier, or maybe he'll start writing his book and leave earlier. But we know that's probably a long shot. And so we have to advocate against it. We have to raise questions about exactly how did this happen and who's benefiting from the privatization of an important social service. But fundamentally, we have to lay the groundwork so that when January of 2018 comes, we can reverse this trend and go back to the way it used to be, at least temporarily, until we can get our single-payer system up and running. But thank you for that question. Yes, sir. Here comes the microphone. And I've got time for one more question after you,
Okay.
so we'll go there.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
What's your name?
Jim Tobias.
Hey,
from,
Jim.
From Matawan. I'm not a lawyer either. I'm much worse.
Oh, great.
I'm an engineer.
Oh,
So I've dedicated
so this will
my,
be fact-based.
well, with some opinions thrown in around
Okay.
it. I've dedicated my career to the concept of universal design, which I know our parents are familiar with, and certainly our advocates in the independent living movement and teachers are as well. And basically it says we don't need specialized equipment or services or programs for people with disabilities. We need inclusion. And in technology inclusion, you know, everybody who's got one of these phones has a screen reader and a you know, an enlargement and a voice recognition system on it, and they're free. They come with the phone.
Right.
Everybody's rolled their luggage up a wheelchair curb cut, or seen a UPS delivery person, you know, do that. So it's the same kind of benefit for everybody of features that may have been thought of once as just for people with disabilities. And we know the concept works. It, you know, it's been proved out many times. But in order to really make it sing, it takes leadership. You have to have a government that sees in each and every program, in education, in workplace, workforce development, in commerce, in, you know, seniors being able to age in place as they choose, where this concept of universal design can be a life changer and actually a cost reducer. So what I'm asking and hoping my next governor can talk to me about is how can you inject and permeate a concept like that that is new, exciting, has an automatic market built into it, companies are responding to it. How can you take that and have it permeate all of our government programs for people with disabilities and others?
Well, I think that's a fantastic question and a great concept. A lot of the issues that you've addressed and others have addressed have at its core an element of leadership, of making sure that the next leader of the state of New Jersey has as a guiding principle advocacy to make sure that happens. Now, there are lots of discrete steps that need to be taken to make sure that that's a reality. When we talk about simple things, we think are simple things like curb cuts and ramps, right, that are pretty ubiquitous now. They're everywhere. But in the development process, there's still quite a bit of back and forth and opposition to actually doing all that's necessary. We need to make sure that we're enforcing those rules and fighting to preserve those rules as we move forward. But I do believe that part of the problem we have in our current government in New Jersey is that we have a leader who has valued politics over policy and people. And so we see a governor who is literally a micromanager in each aspect of state government, more so about the politics than the results. And if I'm fortunate enough to be the governor, what I would want to do is for the Department of Human Services or the Department of Education, I'm going to have two criteria. is to make sure that we hire and find the best person, the most professional and credentialed and qualified person for that position. And then my second requirement is going to be go do a good job and make the state proud. I don't want to decide education policy myself. I'm not an educational expert. I want to have a commissioner of education who understands it and can provide me with the advice and guidance. That's what a cabinet officer is supposed to do. And when it comes to the Department of Human Services, the same concept applies. What we've seen so far is too many decisions made that seem to have more of a political overtone. And so when we talk about the privatization of certain services, you can't help but wonder, as you did in your question, about what the real motivation was behind it. But thank you. I appreciate that question, and I certainly support that idea.
There's a third part of that which is really important, which you can add to that one.
Wait a minute. Nobody can hear you, though. You can talk,
that-
but nobody can hear you.
Okay. There's a third part of that, which is so important. We learned in Newark with respect to the school system, to add to the two things you just said, and that is your commissioners have to listen to the people who they are serving.
That's correct.
And so please add that to
That's
your-
correct. Absolutely. There's somebody.
And we just saw that here because we the people have ideas.
Oh,
and we know how
very
to
good
do
ideas.
things.
So this young lady back here has not had a chance. And this is going to be our last question because my staff is saying that we're running out of time.
It'll be a good one.
Okay. So.
I have a comment. My
What's
name is
your-
Mary Lauco. I'm
Mary, how are
from
you?
Franklin Township, and I have a comment just from my history of being an emancipated minor at 17 and basically being one of those people who couldn't help myself at the time. And I received full funding to go to college at Rutgers University. And so leveling that playing field, I feel, is very important. And I feel like I'm a poster child of success of that. So I'd like to promote continuing to fund the higher educational department and
Sure.
and funding. So I've done very well. I have a great job, and I'm very happy to be paying back multiple times probably the help that I received over those years. So my concern is not that I don't want to pay for these services, but are very important for people that need the help. The question is really efficiency, because as I have done well, I'm paying a lot of taxes, and everybody knows New Jersey property taxes are insane. And so really it's a question of efficiency. Can the state government do anything about the inefficiencies that happen that cause all these huge property taxes? Because they're killing me.
No, you're not alone. And so I don't know if there's any solace in having lots of people join you in that plight, but the reality is that property taxes, when I go out into meetings with constituents or anywhere in the state, one of the most frequently talked about topics is property taxes. And so as I talked about earlier, if we fully fund our education formula, we provide a level of property tax relief. But we also have to recognize that we have a unique and historical problem in the state of New Jersey. We have 565 municipalities. We have 611 school districts. We have more school districts than towns, which still is a little curious. We have 21 counties. We have 88 fire districts. We have 40-some authorities. When you add it all up, there's 1,300 units of local government in New Jersey, and they have one thing in common. Each of those 1,300 units of government have the ability to impose a cost or tax on you. And so we had this discussion, if you remember, several years back. We had a task force of Democrats and Republicans and senators and assembly members who went around the state and had hearings about shared services and consolidation. And we heard two very distinct messages. And many of the people said this. They would get up and they would say, this is shocking. This is way too many units of government. You need to make these towns consolidate, and they ought to share services and link up. And then they would pause and say, but let me tell you about my town. My town is special. And one of the issues that we really have to come to grips with is that we have, right now, all the government we can pay for. The question is do we really want to pay for all of that government, or can we do better? I think that we can achieve efficiencies by looking at sharing services and consolidating. When you look at the history of municipal consolidation in the state of New Jersey, we have had 3 under the 1947 Constitution. We had one in the early 50s down in South Jersey by Millville and Vineland. We had one in the mid-80s. It was a town that almost nobody remembers. It was a town called Pequari Township along the Delaware River, and they had to merge with the neighboring town for the unique set of circumstances that they had 5 municipal offices and only 2 people lived in the town. And so they had no choice. And then we had the 2 Princetons that got together, but it wasn't an easy process, and it took a better part of a decade to get done. And that's because a lot of the statutory law that forms the basis of being able to do either shared services or consolidation really makes it hard to do. And we need to simplify that process. Rutgers University did a study at one point in time that suggested there's up to $1 billion in savings that could be achieved by sharing services and consolidating. And although our state budget is in the $30+ billion range, $1 billion is still a lot of money, and it's something we ought to seriously consider. When we see other states, we see states that have a much more compact way of administering education and municipal services, and so we ought to look at those states as one way of achieving the revenue savings that we see we can achieve by looking at shared service and consolidation. And then finally, the real answer is about changing our taxation structure in New Jersey. Almost 50 years ago now, the New Jersey Supreme Court said to the New Jersey legislature, the way you fund public education is unfair because it really is based upon the good fortune of a child living in a town that is property tax wealthy, or the bad fortune of a child living in a town that's property tax poor. And so the income tax was designed to try to even out those disparities. But over time, that hasn't worked as well as we would have hoped. That is in part why the governor had been talking about his fairness formula, which would have flat funded education across districts and would have hurt a lot of municipalities. I think we can do better by looking at our tax structure and finding a smart way to revise it so that we're not relying entirely on property taxes to fund public education, because it is fundamentally unfair to say that your education is funded on the basis of a value that you really have very little ability to use. I mean, it's not the value of your bank account. It's not the value of your stock holdings. It's the value of a structure that in this market has probably decreased in value over the last couple of years. And so it's really not smart for us to be basing our taxation system on that limited value of a house that nobody can attach the value to. And so I hope that answers the questions you raised. I'm going to stick around, and I'm not going to bolt out the door, but I do want to just end on this note, and I'll stick around and answer as many questions as you'd like, is that, as I said at the beginning, this campaign is about all of you. And it's about all of you making a choice on what you would like to see the future of New Jersey look like. I wanted to be here today to share with you my ideas on how we can make New Jersey better, on my ideas on the things that we haven't done but we should be doing, like a minimum wage increase, a single-payer health care system, free college tuition, making sure that women get paid an equal amount for equal work, and most importantly, supporting the dignity of each and every one of our young men and women who have disabilities, who face a very cruel future under what the Trump administration is proposing. We in New Jersey need to stand up for them, regardless of what the outcome in Washington is, to make sure that we continue to provide them with the dignity of care and assistance and equality that they deserve. Let's talk about this campaign just for a few minutes. This is a campaign that is fueled by people, not by party bosses. I know that you'll hear stories about how 20 or 21 county chairs have made their decision about who the next governor of the state of New Jersey is. What you ought to remember is many of them made that decision in October last year, when we should have been worrying about who the next president of the United States was going to be as opposed to who the next governor was going to be. They took their eye off the ball, and I think the Democratic Party, in a large respect, took its eye off the ball, because we see not only now in Washington the trifecta of both houses of Congress and a president that's Republican. But nationally, we see a disturbing trend in which out of 99 legislative chambers, only 33 are controlled by Democrats. Out of 50 governor's office, only 17 are controlled by Democrats. And so we have to recognize that as a party, nationally, we're not doing something quite right. Otherwise, we wouldn't have those results. And one of the things I believe we're not doing right is we are listening to party leaders as opposed to party members. And this campaign is about changing that dynamic, about listening to the rank and file about what they want, giving the rank and file a voice and an opportunity. Now, I know that if you read any of the papers, listen to any of the TV reports, or hear any of the newscasts, you'll talk about the disadvantage that this campaign has over my opponent, who's got, last time I checked with my wife, he's got a bigger checking account than I do. But the reality is this, is money does not win elections alone. It's message, and it's message that will win this election. Remember in last year's presidential election, the Democratic standard bearer outspent the Republican 5-1. It didn't have a difference. And in this election, we have a message about 21 years of experience that matters for the future of the state of New Jersey, because when we look at where we are in New Jersey, and if anybody is satisfied with where we are today, then I'm not your candidate. But if you think about where we are today, 12 years ago we had a guy run for governor, and that guy was John Corzine, and he said, I'm not from Trenton. And what New Jersey needs is somebody who is from outside of Trenton to make New Jersey better. And he did such a good job in those 4 years that we elected Chris Christie. And interestingly enough, Chris Christie ran on the same platform. I'm not from Trenton. I'm an outsider. Elect me governor, and I'll make New Jersey better. And so after 12 years of outsiders, we have to ask ourselves, does that really work? And when then we look only 250 miles down the highway to Washington, D.C., we see the ultimate outsider, and we have to ask ourselves, does that really work? And so this is a campaign about experience, Main Street values versus Wall Street values, and I think what New Jersey needs is Main Street values. We have my team here today. We have petitions that we'd love to have you sign. We have volunteer sign-up sheets to help us collect more petitions, to help us raise money, because that's how this campaign will be run and how it will be fueled, by people like yourselves. I hope you'll join me, because together we will have success in June. Thank you very much.